church, we're currently going through the book of First Peter on Sunday mornings. I'm preaching verse by verse through First Peter. And this past week, we looked at First Peter chapter 1, verse 14, 15, and 16, where Peter says, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, be holy in all your conduct. For as it is written, be ye holy as I am holy." Of course, a direct quote from Leviticus chapter 11 in the Old Testament. And so as I was preparing for that sermon and thinking about that sobering statement, if you think about it, where God is saying, "Be holy as I am holy," I want to reflect some on the holiness of God. And so, of course, my mind immediately went to a book that I read years ago, a classic work, The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul. And so I decided to take the time and read it again. I don't read books over and over again very often, but R.C. Sproul's book, The Holiness of God, is one of those that you can do that. Actually, I think that's probably the third time I've probably read the book. I read it probably 20 years ago, and then again, I'm thinking maybe about 10 years ago, and then last week, read it again. I was really encouraged by it. It's one of those books that, I recommend books to a lot of people, and sometimes I'll read a book and say, hey, this would be a good book for a pastor or a preacher, or, it might be a book that if somebody's interested in history, they would be interested in, or a parent, or, whatever the case. But The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul is one of those that's on the top of the list, I would say, for any Christian. Whether you're a brand new believer or a mature believer, a young person, an elderly person, man, woman, in the ministry, a lay person, anybody. This is one of those books that I think that every Christian would benefit from. It's written, it's not real technical. R.C. Sproul was a master at putting things in very accessible language, putting it on the bottom shelf, even though sometimes he'll quote Latin and define theological terms, but he makes it where anybody can understand it and access it and be benefited from it. R.C. Sproul wrote like 70 books. I looked it up, about 70 books. He's in heaven now, but very influential on my life. I've read several of his books, but on the top of that list, and The Holiness of God is probably the book that he's most known for. And so, like I said, it's a classic. If you haven't read it, let me encourage you to do so. Basically, what he does is, and really all of his R.C. Sproul's ministry, one of the big things that he would often say is that one of the major problems in American Christianity, modern American Christianity, is that we don't know who God is. We've lost that understanding of the transcendence of God, the holiness of God. And so he writes this book, and he starts out with a book that I love the first chapter. It's sort of almost elevated prose. He tells about the story about when he was in college, and way back in college, and woke up in the middle of the night one night with this overwhelming urge to go to the chapel on campus. And so he gets up, gets dressed, and he tells a story about remembering the cracking of the frozen snow under his feet and the light of the moon in the quad as he made his way across campus and then to the chapel there, and opening this old Gothic door and stepping across that threshold and making his way in the middle of the night up to the chancel and falling on his face and just being overwhelmed by the holiness of God. And as he relates that experience, of course, understanding the holiness of God is not just an emotional experience, but it's not less than that, he says. We need to tremble at the holiness of God. And then he takes a couple of chapters just explaining what the Bible says about the holiness of God. What is the holiness of God and the attribute of the holiness of God, and makes an argument that I would agree with, that for the holiness being the main attribute of God. Out of all God's attributes, it's the top attribute of God. It's the only attribute of God, by the way, that the Bible brings to the third level. And in Hebrew, way of Hebrew expressions. When you double something, you say something twice, that's how they emphasize it. That's how they we would underline something, bold it, put it in italics or whatever. Hebrews would say something twice. Well, the attribute of God, the only attribute of God that the Bible brings to the third level, says it 3 times, is His holiness. Holy, holy, holy. And we think of Isaiah chapter 6, where we hear the angels, where Isaiah, you can look back at Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah, and it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and His train, His glory, filled the temple. And He falls on His face in the presence of the holiness of God. And we hear those angels crying out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, and the whole earth is full of His glory. Never does the Bible say, R.C. Sproul points out that never does the Bible say that God's is righteous, righteous, righteous. Even though He is completely righteous, but His righteousness is a holy righteousness. Never said the Bible says that God is love, but it didn't say love, love, love. God is love, but it's a holy love. It's a holy righteousness. It's a holy, and so every one of God's attributes are holy, and so it really encompasses all of who God is, to focus on God's holiness, that He is set apart, that He is different. That's what the word holy means. And so he looks at that, and then he goes through different chapters. He deals with various people in the Bible that are encountering God's holiness, like Isaiah and Job and several others. And then in Christian history, as a chapter on Martin Luther, in his understanding of the holiness of God, and Jonathan Edwards' understanding of the holiness of God, and deals with the issue of be holy as I am holy, God says. And so it's just an excellent book. I cannot recommend it enough. I wanted to just give it to you. I won't belabor this any longer, but The Holiness of God, if you haven't read it, I'll put a link in the description, by the way, and you can buy it from Amazon. You can get it from basically anywhere that books are sold. But get it and read it if you haven't done so already. If you've read it before, consider reading it again. It's an excellent resource as we think of the holiness of God by R.C. Sproul.